Stop right there." The voice didn't need to be loud to command the entire lobby. It carried weight, the kind that made conversations die mid-sentence and heels pause against polished marble, and Jordan Hayes felt it before he even turned, a subtle shift in the air, like the room itself had decided to pay attention, and when he did turn, rain still clinging to the edges of his worn jacket, he found himself face to face with William Carter, a man whose name was etched into skyscrapers and whispered across boardrooms from New York to Silicon Valley, his suit flawless, his posture effortless, his eyes sharp with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been ignored in his life, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood there, two worlds colliding under the soft gold glow of chandeliers, until William took a slow step forward and said, almost casually, "You don't look like you belong here." The words hung in the air, not shouted, not cruel, just precise, like a measurement, and a few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen while hearing every syllable, but Jordan didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't apologize, he simply met the man's gaze and answered, calm and steady, "I was just leaving." That should have been the end of it, a passing moment in a busy hotel, forgotten before the doors even closed, but something in Jordan's voice, or maybe the lack of fear in it, made William pause, his head tilting slightly as if reassessing a calculation that didn't quite add up, and then, without warning, he reached back and took a leather bag from his assistant, heavy, structured, the kind of bag that didn't travel alone, and held it out between them, the gesture simple but loaded, "Take this." "To the penthouse," he said, his tone smooth, controlled, "don't open it. Do that, and I'll pay you $10,000. A quiet ripple moved through the lobby, not loud enough to be called a reaction, but enough to be felt, eyes flicking toward Jordan now with curiosity, judgment, expectation, and the number itself seemed to echo in the space between them, $10,000 for a short elevator ride, for a simple task, for trust that didn't exist, and Jordan's eyes dropped briefly to the bag, noticing the subtle weight of it, the way the leather strained just slightly at the seams, then lifted back to William's face, searching, not for permission, but for intent, and whatever he saw there made him reach out and take it, his fingers steady, his grip firm. "Penthouse," he repeated quietly, as if locking the word into place, and William gave a small nod, already turning away, already finished, as though the outcome had been decided the moment the offer left his lips. But what he didn't see, what none of them saw, was the brief tightening of Jordan's jaw as the bag settled into his hand, heavier than expected, not just in pounds but in meaning, and as he walked toward the elevator, the sound of his damp sneakers against marble soft but deliberate, the room seemed to exhale behind him, conversation slowly returning, though softer now, threaded with speculation, while above them, unseen cameras blinked quietly, capturing every step, every hesitation, every choice waiting to be made, and inside the elevator, as the doors slid shut. With a muted whisper, sealing him away from the eyes below, Jordan finally allowed himself a breath, slow and measured, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored walls, a man alone with a decision that felt far bigger than a simple delivery, and as the numbers above the door began to climb, 10, 14, 21, he shifted the bag slightly in his hands, feeling something inside move just enough to break the illusion of simplicity, and in that small, almost imperceptible moment, the test had already begun, though no one had said it out loud, and somewhere far below, William Carter watched the screen with quiet confidence, waiting for the exact second a stranger would prove him right. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor, the sound almost too gentle for the weight sitting in Jordan Hayes's hands, and when the doors slid open, the hallway stretched out in perfect silence, thick carpet swallowing his footsteps, walls lined with framed abstract art that felt more expensive than expressive, and for a second he just stood there, not moving, not rushing, letting the stillness press in around him as if the building itself was watching, and then he stepped out, the leather bag shifting slightly again, just enough to remind him that whatever was inside was not as simple as it had been presented, and his grip tightened instinctively, not out of fear, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when something does not feel right but no one has told you why, and he walked slowly toward the penthouse door, each step deliberate, each breath steady, until he stopped a few feet away, the gold numbers gleaming under soft light, untouched, waiting, and that was when he noticed it, a faint crease along the zipper line, as if it had been opened before and closed in a hurry. And his eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, not yet, but questioning, and he lowered the bag carefully to the floor, crouching just enough to steady it, his fingers brushing the leather, feeling the firmness beneath, and for a long moment he did nothing, just stared, the silence stretching again, heavier this time, filled with choices that no one else could make for him, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, he pulled the zipper back an inch, just enough to see inside, and his breath caught. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in that quiet, controlled way that comes when something confirms exactly what you hoped was not true, stacks of cash, tightly bundled, crisp, untouched, and beneath them, a sealed envelope marked confidential in bold black letters, the kind that did not belong in a simple errand, the kind that carried consequences, and Jordan exhaled slowly, closing the bag just as carefully as he had opened it, his mind not racing, not panicking, but settling into something clearer, something sharper, and he stood, lifting the bag. Again, feeling its weight now with full understanding, not just money, but a decision disguised as opportunity, and instead of turning toward the penthouse door, he turned back toward the elevator, his step steady, unhurried, as if the choice had already been made long before he reached this floor, and as the elevator carried him back down, the mirrored walls reflecting the same calm expression, the same quiet resolve. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only certainty, and when the doors opened again to the lobby, the atmosphere had changed, subtle but unmistakable, security now positioned closer than before, their attention fixed, their posture alert, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment, and Jordan walked forward anyway, not defensive, not aggressive, simply present, until one of the guards stepped into his path, voice firm but controlled, asking him to stop, to place the bag down, and for a brief second, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath again, conversations fading, eyes turning, waiting for the outcome they had already predicted, but Jordan did not argue, did not explain, he simply extended the bag forward with both hands, offering it back without resistance, his voice even, clear, "This belongs to him," and the guard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, caught between expectation and reality, and that was when William Carter stepped forward. From the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable now, the earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something less certain, as he looked at the man in front of him, not as a stranger anymore, but as a question he had not prepared for, and for the first time since this began, the outcome no longer felt guaranteed. William Carter did not reach for the bag immediately, and that hesitation alone was enough to shift the balance of the entire room, because men like him did not hesitate, they acted, they decided, they controlled, but now he stood there, eyes fixed on Jordan Hayes, studying him again, only this time without the quiet certainty he carried before, and Jordan did not lower his hands, did not pull back. He simply held the bag steady, offering it without urgency, without expectation, as if returning. It was not an act of virtue but something far more ordinary, something that required no recognition at all, and the silence stretched between them, long enough for the people nearby to begin whispering again, their assumptions rearranging themselves in real time, until William finally stepped forward and took the bag, his fingers brushing the leather slowly, deliberately, as though confirming it was real, as though confirming what he had just seen was real, and when he looked up again, there was a question behind his eyes that had not been there before. "You opened it," he said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating a fact, and Jordan nodded once, calm, direct, yes, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften the truth, and that alone seemed to unsettle something deeper, because the test had not been about perfection, it had been about temptation, about weakness, about proving a point that had worked too many times before, and yet here stood a man who had seen everything inside that bag and still chose to walk back, and William exhaled slowly, glancing briefly toward the security cameras above, then back at Jordan. "Most people would not have done that," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the performance it had carried earlier, but Jordan's expression did not change, did not brighten, did not seek approval, he simply answered, "Most people are not trying to figure out why they are being tested," and that sentence landed differently, heavier, because it did not just respond to the situation, it exposed it, and for a brief second, William said nothing, his jaw tightening just slightly as the weight of that realization settled in, and around them the lobby seemed to lean in again, drawn not by spectacle now but by something more subtle, something real, and William shifted the bag in his hand, then asked, almost carefully, "So why did you come back?" And Jordan met his gaze without hesitation, his voice steady, grounded, "Because whatever is in that bag is not mine, and whatever you were expecting me to do with it, that is not who I am." And there it was, not a speech, not a declaration, just a simple truth delivered without effort, and William blinked once, slow, absorbing it, because for the first time in a very long time, he was standing in front of someone he could not predict, could not measure, could not reduce to a pattern or a probability. And the realization unsettled him more than any failure ever had, and then, almost as if trying to regain control of the moment, he said, $10,000 is still yours." But even as he said it, the words sounded smaller, less powerful than before, and Jordan shook his head lightly, not dismissive, not proud, just certain, "I did not bring it back for money." And that was when the room truly went still, not because of the action, but because of what it meant, because the one thing William Carter had built his entire world around, the one thing that solved every problem, opened every door, and defined every outcome, had just been quietly refused without hesitation. And he looked at Jordan again, longer this time, as if searching for something he might have missed, some hidden angle, some strategy, but there was none, just a man standing there, steady and unshaken, and for the first time in years, William found himself without a move to make, without a response that could restore the balance he had always controlled. And as the silence deepened once more, it became clear to everyone watching that the test had not ended the way it was supposed to, because the one being measured was no longer the stranger who walked in from the rain. William Carter did not move right away, and that stillness began to draw a different kind of attention, not curiosity anymore but something closer to tension, because the man who had just offered $10,000 like it was nothing now stood there as if the number had lost all meaning. And Jordan Hayes remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, not waiting, not expecting, simply present in a way that made everything else in the room feel staged by comparison. And after a long moment, William let out a quiet breath and adjusted his grip on the leather bag, as though grounding himself in something familiar, something he understood. "You think this was a trick," he said finally, his voice measured again but lacking the edge it once carried. And Jordan tilted his head slightly, considering the question before answering. "No," he said calmly, "I think it was a question." And that answer landed differently, softer but deeper, because it shifted the entire moment from control to curiosity, from power to perspective, and William's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion but in thought, as if recalculating something he had not expected to revisit, and he took a slow step closer, lowering his voice so that only Jordan could hear him clearly. "And what did you think the question was?" he asked, and Jordan did not hesitate. "Whether I would choose easy money over who I am," he replied, his tone even, without pride, without defensiveness, just clarity. And for a brief second, William looked almost unsettled, because that answer did not just describe the test, it exposed the intention behind it, and that was something far less comfortable. And around them the room continued to exist, people walking, voices murmuring, but the space between them felt separate now, contained, like everything else had faded into the background. And William glanced down at the bag again, then back up. "And you passed," he said, as if trying to restore the structure of the moment, as if labeling it could make it manageable again. But Jordan shook his head slightly, the smallest movement, yet enough to shift everything once more. "That depends," he said, and William frowned, not out of irritation but confusion. "On what?" he asked, and Jordan met his gaze, steady as before. "On whether you were testing me or yourself," he answered, and that was when the silence returned, heavier than before, not empty but full, filled with a truth that neither of them could ignore. And William's expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, a subtle softening around the eyes, a slight pause in his posture, as if something inside him had been caught off guard. And for the first time since this began, he did not have a response ready, did not have a line to deliver or a conclusion to draw, and instead he stood there, holding the bag, looking at a man who had just stepped outside the boundaries of his expectations without raising his voice or making a scene, and it unsettled him in a way that no negotiation or failure ever had, because it was not about losing, it was about not understanding, and after a moment, he cleared his throat quietly, almost reflexively. "Come with me," he said, gesturing toward a private corridor beyond the lobby, his tone no longer commanding but inviting, and Jordan hesitated just briefly, not out of fear but out of consideration, then gave a small nod and followed, his steps unhurried, matching the pace of a man who was no longer leading as confidently as before, and as they walked away from the open space into a quieter, more secluded area, the noise of the lobby faded behind them, replaced by a softer, more controlled silence, the kind that belonged to decisions that mattered, and when they reached a small lounge tucked away from view, William set the bag down on a glass table, his hand lingering on it for a second longer than necessary before he turned back to Jordan, his posture less rigid now. "Less certain, you said you knew something was off," he began, his voice lower, more reflective. "When did you realize?" And Jordan leaned slightly against the back of a chair, relaxed but attentive. "When the offer was too easy," he said. "Nothing that simple comes without a reason," and William gave a faint, almost involuntary nod, as if acknowledging a truth he had always known but rarely heard spoken back to him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence now no longer tense but thoughtful, and in that quiet space, something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably, because the test that had begun in control had now turned into something else entirely, something neither of them had planned. And as William looked at Jordan again, really looked this time, it became clear that whatever came next would not be something he could script in advance. William Carter remained standing for a moment after Jordan finished speaking, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the glass table as if grounding himself in something solid while everything else felt less certain, and then slowly, almost deliberately, he took a seat across from Jordan, not behind a desk, not at the head of the room, but directly opposite him. A subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by most people yet carried a quiet significance, and for the first time since the encounter began, his posture was not that of a man asserting control but of one trying to understand, and the silence between them settled again, softer now, less like tension and more like space waiting to be filled with something real. "I have done this before," William said finally, his voice low, reflective, not defensive but honest in a way that surprised even him. "Different people, different settings, different amounts, but the result is always the same," and he paused briefly, as if replaying those moments in his mind. "They take it, or they try to justify taking it," he added, his gaze drifting to the leather bag on the table before returning to Jordan. "It tells me what I need to know," and Jordan listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, attentive but not impressed, and when William finished, he nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its conclusion. "It tells you what they do under pressure," Jordan replied calmly, "but not who they are when no one is watching," and that distinction lingered in the air, subtle but powerful, because it suggested that the test itself might be incomplete, and William leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing that thought, his fingers interlacing loosely as he considered it. "So you think I am wrong?" he said, not sharply, not defensively, just asking, and Jordan shook his head gently. "I think you are used to being right because you designed the situation," he answered, his tone steady, respectful but unyielding, "but that does not mean you are seeing the whole picture," and for a brief second, something flickered across William's face, not anger, not offense, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone says something you have never heard out loud but have always known somewhere beneath the surface, and he exhaled quietly, a slow release of breath that carried more weight than it should have. "And what do you think I missed?" he asked, leaning forward just slightly now, his attention fully fixed, and Jordan did not rush his answer, did not fill the silence too quickly, instead letting it sit for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "You assumed the choice was about the money," he said, "but it was not." And William's brow furrowed just enough to show his curiosity. "Then what was it about?" he pressed, and Jordan met his gaze without hesitation. "It was about whether I would let someone else define my value," he said simply, and the words landed with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable in their clarity, and William sat back again, slower this time, his eyes dropping briefly to the table before lifting again. And for the first time since this began, there was no calculation behind them, no immediate response forming. Just thought, deep and unguarded, and the room seemed to hold that moment gently, without pressure. without urgency, as if allowing something new to take shape, and after a while, William reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook, the movement almost instinctive, almost automatic, and he began to write, the pen moving smoothly across the paper, $10,000, just as promised, and when he finished, he tore the check cleanly and placed it on the table between them, sliding it forward slightly, not as an offer this time, but as a fulfillment. A deal is a deal, he said quietly, and Jordan glanced down at the check, then back up at William, his expression unchanged, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might leave it there, untouched, but instead he reached out, not to take it, but to turn it slightly so. It faced William again, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet filled with meaning. You can keep it, he said calmly, because whatever this was supposed to prove, it already did, and William's hand remained still on the table, his eyes fixed on the check now returned to him, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, because for the first time, the transaction he had relied on his entire life had been quietly undone, and the value he thought he understood no longer fit the moment in front of him, and as he looked up once more at Jordan Hayes, it became clear that this was no longer about a test, or a result, but about a truth he had not expected to face, and perhaps was not yet ready to fully accept. William Carter did not touch the check for several seconds after Jordan turned it back toward him, and in that small, quiet pause, the weight of the moment seemed to settle deeper than anything that had been said aloud, because this was not a negotiation he could adjust, not a number he could increase, not a situation he could outmaneuver with experience. It was something simpler and far more unsettling, something he could not control, and he slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the check as if it might explain itself if he stared long enough, but it did not. It just lay there, ordinary paper in an extraordinary silence, and across from him, Jordan Hayes remained calm, composed, not waiting for a reaction, not filling the space with unnecessary words, just allowing the moment to exist as it was, and eventually William let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, a quiet exhale that seemed to release something inside him, something rigid, something practiced, and he reached forward at last, not to take the check back into his pocket, but to fold it once, slowly, deliberately, and set it aside on the table as if acknowledging that whatever value it represented no longer applied here, and when he looked up again, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but real, the kind that comes when certainty begins to give way to reflection. You know, he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier precision. Most people would have walked out of here feeling like they won, and he paused, studying Jordan's face for any sign of agreement, but found none, only that same steady presence, and Jordan responded simply, that depends on what they think winning is, and the words did not challenge, did not provoke, they just existed, clear and grounded, and William nodded faintly, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a truth he had spent years overlooking, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence, now no longer heavy but reflective, as though it carried thought instead of tension, and William shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the leather bag again before returning to Jordan. When I saw you in the lobby, he began slowly, choosing his words with more care than before, I thought I already knew how this would end, and there was no arrogance in the statement now, only honesty, and Jordan listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, attentive but not engaged in the need to respond immediately, and William continued, I thought I could measure you in a few minutes, maybe even seconds, he added, a faint, almost self-aware smile touching his expression, I have built an entire life doing exactly that, and he glanced briefly at his hands, as if recognizing the pattern in them, but you did something I did not account for, and that sentence lingered, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity, and Jordan tilted his head slightly. Not asking, but open to hearing more, and William met his gaze again, more directly this time, you did not play the role I expected, he said, and Jordan's response came just as calmly, that is because I was not there to play one, and the exchange, brief as it was, seemed to settle something deeper between them, because it removed the last layer of assumption that had been guiding the entire encounter, and William leaned back once more, this time not as a gesture of control but of acceptance. And for the first time since the test began, there was no agenda behind his next words. What do you do, Jordan? He asked, the question simple, almost ordinary, yet carrying a different kind of weight now. and Jordan answered without hesitation, "I work construction," he said, "mostly residential projects, sometimes commercial if the job is big enough, and—" William nodded slowly, taking that in, not as a data point, not as a category, but as part of a person he was beginning to see more clearly, and after a moment, he spoke again, more thoughtfully this time, "And if I told you I could change that," he said, "not offering, not promising, just stating a possibility, would that matter to you?" And Jordan considered the question briefly, not because it was tempting, but because it deserved an honest answer, and then he said, "It would matter how." And that response, quiet and precise, seemed to land even deeper than the ones before, because it did not reject the idea of opportunity, it redefined the conditions under which it would be accepted, and William's expression shifted again, this time with something closer to respect, not given easily, not offered lightly, but earned in a way he was not used to, and as the silence returned once more, it carried a different tone now, not uncertainty, not tension, but possibility, the kind that does not come from control, but from understanding that something has changed, even if you cannot yet fully explain how. William Carter did not respond immediately to Jordan's answer, and that pause carried a different weight than before, not confusion this time, but consideration, as if he was carefully stepping through unfamiliar ground where the usual shortcuts no longer applied, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his posture no longer guarded by distance or authority, but open in a way that felt almost unintentional. "That is fair," he said quietly, acknowledging the condition. Without resistance, and his eyes shifted briefly toward the window behind Jordan, where the city stretched out in layers of glass and light, a view he had seen thousands of times without really looking, and for a moment, it seemed like he was seeing it differently now, not as something he owned or influenced, but as something that existed beyond him, and when his gaze returned, there was a subtle change in it, less calculation, more presence. "Tell me something," he said, his tone steady but softer than before. "When you opened that bag upstairs, what was the first thing you thought?" And Jordan did not answer right away, not because he did not know, but because he understood the question was no longer about the moment itself, but about the meaning behind it, and after a brief pause, he said, "I thought about how easy it would be to walk away with it," and he let that sit for a second before continuing, "and then I thought about how hard it would be to live with that choice afterward," and the contrast in those two sentences settled into the room quietly, not dramatic, not heavy, just clear, and William nodded once, slowly, as if the answer aligned with something he had not been able to articulate himself, and he looked down at his hands again, turning them slightly as though examining something invisible. "I built everything I have by making decisions quickly," he said, almost to himself, seeing opportunity, taking it, moving forward without hesitation, and there was no pride in the statement now, only reflection, and Jordan listened, his expression steady, allowing the thought to unfold without interruption, and William continued. "I told myself that was strength," he added, lifting his gaze again, "that being decisive, being efficient, was what set me apart," and he paused, his voice lowering just slightly, "but maybe I stopped asking why along the way," and that admission, quiet as it was, seemed to shift something deeper in the space between them, because it was not a defense, not an explanation, but a realization forming in real time, and Jordan responded simply, "There is nothing wrong with moving fast," he said, "but it matters what you are moving toward," and William let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet laugh, though without humor, more like recognition, and he leaned back again, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show that whatever tension had been holding him earlier was beginning to release, and for a moment, the two men sat in silence again, but this time it was not filled with expectation or pressure, it was reflective, almost calm, as if both of them understood that something important had already happened, even if it had not been fully named, and after a while, William stood up slowly, walking toward the window, his hands slipping into his pockets as he looked out over the city again, the lights now sharper against the growing dusk, and he spoke without turning around, his voice carrying a quiet honesty that had not been there before. "Do you know what surprised me the most?" he said, and Jordan remained seated, his posture unchanged, waiting, and William answered his own question. "It was not that you returned the money," he said, "it was that you never looked like you needed it," and that observation hung in the air, not as a compliment, but as a realization, because it challenged something fundamental in the way he had always seen people, and Jordan considered that for a moment before replying. "Everyone needs something," he said, but not everything is worth taking, and... William turned slightly at that, just enough to glance back, his expression thoughtful, almost searching, and for the first time since this began, there was no trace of the man who had orchestrated the test, only someone trying to understand a perspective he had never truly encountered before, and as the room settled into that quiet understanding, it became clear that whatever this encounter had started as, it was no longer about proving anything, but about seeing something that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. William Carter remained by the window for a long moment after Jordan's last words, his gaze fixed on the city but no longer seeing it the way he always had, because something subtle had shifted, something he could not quite name yet could not ignore either, and behind him, Jordan Hayes stood slowly, not out of impatience, not out of discomfort, but because the moment had reached a natural pause, the kind that does not need to be filled, and he adjusted his jacket slightly, the fabric still faintly damp from the rain earlier, a quiet reminder that his world existed beyond this room, beyond this conversation, and when William finally turned back around, his expression carried something new, not authority, not certainty, but a kind of awareness that had not been there before. I used to believe that if you gave people the chance, they would always show you who they really are, he said, his voice thoughtful, measured, and that I could use that to understand them quickly, and he took a few steps back toward the table, his movements slower now, less deliberate in the way of control and more in the way of reflection, but maybe I was only seeing what I expected to see, he added quietly, and Jordan met his gaze without hesitation, his presence steady as ever. People do show you who they are, he replied, but only if you are not trying to control the outcome, and that distinction seemed to land deeper than anything else, because it reframed the entire idea of the test, not as a tool for discovery, but as a limitation disguised as insight, and William nodded faintly, absorbing that, his eyes briefly dropping to the leather bag still resting on the table, untouched since it had been returned, and for a moment, he simply looked at it, as if it now represented something entirely different from what it had at the beginning, and then he spoke again, more quietly than before. You said earlier that you were trying to understand why I would leave it, he said, lifting his eyes back to Jordan, so what did you decide? And Jordan did not rush his answer, not because he was unsure, but because he understood the weight of the question, and after a brief pause, he said, I think you were not testing whether someone would take it, and he held William's gaze as he continued. You were testing whether you still believed in people, and the words settled into the room with a quiet clarity that seemed to echo beyond their simplicity, and William's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time, not in resistance, not in denial, but in recognition, as if something he had been avoiding had just been placed in front of him without any way to look away, and he let out a slow breath. The kind that comes when a truth lands deeper than expected. And what do you think I found? He asked, his voice almost careful now, and Jordan's answer came just as steady. That depends on what you are willing to accept, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no challenge, just an open truth, and William looked at him for a long moment, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less like a gap and more like a space where something real was forming, and then, almost without thinking, William reached for the leather bag, unzipping it fully this time and looking inside, not to check its contents, but as if seeing it from a new perspective, the stacks of money now appearing less like value and more like a question he had been asking for years without realizing it, and he closed it again slowly, placing it back on the table with a quiet finality, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a calm that had not been there before. I have spent a long time believing that control was the same as understanding, he said, but today feels different, and Jordan nodded slightly, not in agreement or approval, but in acknowledgement, and for a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the city beyond the window continuing its endless motion, unaware that something small yet significant had just shifted inside that quiet room, and then Jordan reached for the back of the chair, steadying himself as he prepared to leave, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the conversation had reached its point, and William watched him, not with the detached curiosity from before, but with a focus that suggested he understood the importance of what was about to happen next, even if he did not yet know what it would be. Jordan Hayes did not rush toward the door, and that alone seemed to hold William Carter in place for just a moment longer, because there was something about the way Jordan moved, steady, unhurried, that made the moment feel unfinished, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, unresolved way that lingered beneath the surface, and as Jordan reached for the handle, William spoke again, not loudly, not sharply, but with a weight that carried farther than volume ever could. "Wait," he said, and Jordan paused, his hand resting lightly against the door, not tense, not reluctant, just still, and after a brief second, he turned back, his expression unchanged, open but not expectant, and William took a step forward, closing some of the distance between them, not to reassert control, but as if trying to meet him somewhere more equal. "You said something earlier," William began, his voice measured but quieter than before, "about not letting someone else define your value," and he paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. "I have spent my entire life defining value," he added, a faint, almost ironic edge touching his tone, "companies, deals, people, everything," and he looked at Jordan directly, without the filter of assumption this time, "and yet I did not recognize it when it stood right in front of me," and the admission was simple, but it carried a depth that was not easy for someone like him to offer, and Jordan listened without interrupting, his posture steady, his gaze level, allowing the moment to unfold without pushing it forward, and William continued, "I thought I was testing you," he said, "but now I am starting to think I was testing something else entirely," and he glanced briefly at the leather bag on the table before returning his attention to Jordan. "Something I was not sure still existed," and the room seemed to settle around those words, not reacting, not echoing, just holding them, and Jordan's response came just as calmly as everything before. "It exists," he said, "but not where you are looking for it," and that answer did not challenge, did not criticize, it simply redirected, and William let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, as if accepting that shift rather than resisting it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence now filled with something quieter, something closer to understanding than uncertainty, and then William reached into his pocket again, not for the check this time, but for a small, simple card, unremarkable at first glance except for the name printed on it, and he stepped closer, extending it toward Jordan, not as a command, not as a transaction, but as an invitation. "If you ever decide that how matters," he said, referencing Jordan's earlier words, "call me." And there was no pressure in his voice, no expectation, just an openness that had not been there before. And Jordan looked at the card for a moment, then back at William, as if weighing not the offer, but the intention behind it, and after a brief pause, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing the edge lightly, not as acceptance of a promise, but as acknowledgement of a possibility, and he slipped it into his jacket without looking at it again. "I will," he said simply, and there was no urgency in his tone, no excitement, just calm certainty, and William nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning now than anything he had said earlier, and as Jordan turned back toward the door, this time there was no interruption, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding that the moment had reached its natural end, and he opened it, stepping out into the hallway where the soft lighting and distant hum of the building greeted him once again, and as the door closed gently behind him, William remained where he was, standing in the center of the room, the leather bag still resting on the table, the check still untouched, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about the next move, the next decision, or the next outcome. He was simply standing there, replaying a conversation that had not followed any of the rules he had built his life around, and as the silence settled fully once more, it became clear that whatever had just happened was not something that could be measured, not in dollars, not in outcomes, but only in the quiet shift of something deeper, something he had not realized he was searching for until it stood in front of him and walked away. The hallway outside felt quieter than it had just minutes ago, or maybe Jordan Hayes was simply more aware of it now, the soft hum of distant elevators, the muted footsteps behind closed doors, the kind of subtle sounds that only became noticeable when everything inside you had settled into clarity, and he walked at the same steady pace, not rushing, not slowing, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of his jacket where the card now rested, not as something he needed, but as something he had chosen to accept on his own terms, and when the elevator doors opened, he stepped inside without hesitation, turning to face the mirrored wall as the doors slid shut with a quiet finality, and for a moment he simply stood there, his reflection staring back at him, unchanged, unshaken, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and yet something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. And as the elevator began its descent, the numbers ticking down one by one, his mind did not race ahead to what came next, it stayed present, grounded in the decision he had already made, because for him, the moment had not been about opportunity or loss, it had been about alignment, about walking away from something that did not feel right and knowing exactly why, and when the doors opened again into the lobby, the atmosphere had returned to its usual rhythm, conversations flowing, footsteps echoing across the marble, the earlier tension dissolved into the background of a busy evening. But a few lingering glances followed him as he walked through, not because of what they understood, but because of what they sensed, something different, something they could not quite place, and Jordan moved through it all without acknowledging it, pushing open the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the cool air, the city stretching before him in a mix of movement and light, and for a moment he paused just outside, not dramatically, just enough to take in a quiet breath, the kind that marks the end of something without needing to announce it, and then he continued forward, disappearing into the flow of people and traffic as if he had always been part of it, and far above, in that quiet room overlooking the city, William Carter had not moved from where he stood, his eyes still resting on the closed door, as though expecting something more, some final resolution that had not yet arrived, but none came, only silence. And after a while, he turned slowly back toward the table, the leather bag still in the same place, the folded check resting beside it, untouched, unchanged, and he walked over, placing his hand lightly on the bag, not to open it, not to check it, but as if acknowledging its presence in a new way, and then he picked up the check, unfolding it carefully, the amount still clear, still significant, yet somehow diminished in meaning, and he held it there for a moment before setting it back down again, not torn, not discarded, just left where it was, because it no longer represented what it once had, and he moved toward the window once more, looking out at the city lights now brighter against the darkening sky, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not see opportunity in them, he did not see expansion or control, he saw people, individual lives moving in directions he could not predict, could not measure, and that realization did not unsettle him the way it might have before. It grounded him, quietly, unexpectedly, and as he stood there, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, overlapping with the city beyond, he reached into his pocket and felt for the space where the card had once been before he had handed it over, a small absence that carried more weight than he would have thought, and he let his hand fall back to his side, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by the need to act, and the room remained still around him, not empty, but complete in a way that did not require anything more, and as the seconds passed, it became clear that what had started as a simple test had ended in something far more complex, something that could not be repeated or replicated, because it had not been about the situation at all, it had been about the people within it, and as William Carter stood there, looking out over a city he thought he understood, he realized that for the first time, he was not searching for answers, he was sitting with the questions, and somehow, that felt more important than anything he had gained before. The night had fully settled over the city by the time William Carter finally stepped away from the window, the glass now reflecting more of him than the skyline beyond it, and for a moment he stood there, looking at that reflection as if it belonged to someone he was only beginning to recognize, and then he turned back toward the room, his gaze drifting once again to the table where the leather bag and the folded check remained untouched, quiet symbols of something that no longer held the same meaning they had just an hour ago, and he walked over slowly, not with purpose, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, as if revisiting a moment that had not fully settled yet, and he reached out, opening the bag once more, his eyes scanning the neatly stacked cash inside, the sealed envelope beneath it, everything exactly as it had been before, unchanged, controlled, predictable, and yet it felt different now, not because the contents had shifted, but because his understanding of them had, and he closed it again gently, his hand resting on top of it for a brief second before he pulled back, as if acknowledging that whatever this object had been meant to prove, it no longer held that power, and he moved toward the chair where Jordan had been sitting earlier, pausing just behind it, his hand brushing lightly against the backrest, a small, almost unconscious gesture, and for a moment he could almost hear the echo of that steady voice, calm, grounded, certain in a way that had not needed to be declared, and it unsettled him not because it challenged his authority, but because it revealed something he had overlooked, something he had stopped seeing clearly, and he lowered himself into the chair slowly, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the empty space in front of him, not searching for answers, not forming plans. Just sitting with the absence of something that had briefly filled the room with clarity, and after a while, he reached for his phone, not to call anyone, not to check messages, but simply holding it in his hand as if considering the habits that had once defined every moment of his day, and then, almost deliberately, he placed it back down on the table without unlocking it, a small decision that carried more meaning than it should have, and the silence returned again, deeper this time, more settled, and in that quiet, something unexpected surfaced, not a strategy, not a conclusion, but a memory, faint at first, then clearer, of a time long before boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, when decisions were not calculated for maximum return, but felt instinctively right or wrong, and he exhaled slowly, the realization settling in with a quiet weight, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening to that instinct, replacing it with systems, metrics, and control, and now, for the first time in years, someone had walked into his world and reminded him of what that instinct felt like, not through argument, not through force, but through action, simple, undeniable, and he leaned back in the chair, his eyes closing briefly as if allowing that realization to settle fully, and when he opened them again, the room looked the same, the city outside unchanged, the objects around him exactly where they had been, but something inside him had shifted, something subtle but irreversible, and he stood up slowly, moving toward the table once more, picking up the check and looking at it for a long moment before folding it again and placing it carefully inside the drawer of the side table, not discarded, not forgotten, but set aside as something that no longer needed to be resolved, and then he turned off the lights, one by one, the room dimming into a softer, quieter version of itself, until only the glow from the city remained, filtering through the glass, and as he made his way toward the door, he paused for just a second, his hand resting on the handle, not hesitating, but acknowledging the moment before stepping forward, and when he finally left the room, closing the door gently behind him, it was not with the sense of ending something, but with the quiet understanding that something had already begun, something that would not be measured in numbers or outcomes, but in the way he chose to see the world from that point forward, and as the hallway light stretched ahead of him, steady and unchanged, William Carter walked forward without the need to define where he was going next, only knowing that for the first time in a long time, he was paying attention to why. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the city already alive with movement and noise as sunlight slipped between buildings and reflected off glass and steel, and William Carter stood in his office overlooking it all, the same view he had seen for years, yet something about it felt quieter now, not because the world had changed, but because he had, and he stood there for a long moment with a cup of coffee untouched in his hand, his thoughts not rushing ahead to meetings or deals, but lingering in a place he was not used to staying, reflection, and behind him, the large desk remained organized as always, documents stacked neatly, screens glowing with schedules and projections, everything exactly as it should be, except for one small detail, the folded check now resting in the corner of the desk, not filed away, not processed, just there, visible, a quiet reminder of something that could not be reduced to numbers, and he finally turned away from the window, setting the coffee down without taking a sip, his attention shifting not to his usual priorities, but to something simpler, something unfinished, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, pausing briefly as if considering the weight of the action, then scrolling through contacts with a focus that was different from his usual precision, less about efficiency and more about intention, and when he found the name he was looking for, he did not call immediately, he just stared at it for a second, as if acknowledging that this was not part of his routine, and then he pressed dial, holding the phone to his ear as the line rang, once, twice, each second stretching slightly longer than expected, and then a voice answered, calm, steady, unmistakable, hello, and William did not speak right away, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because for once, he was not trying to control how it would sound, and when he finally did, his voice carried a tone that had not been there before. Jordan, it is William, he said. Simple, direct, and on the other end, there was a brief pause. Not confusion, not hesitation, just recognition. I know, Jordan replied, and there was something about that response, quiet and grounded, that made William straighten slightly, as if stepping into the moment fully. I wanted to ask you something, William continued, his words measured but not rehearsed, and I want you to answer honestly, and there was no challenge in his tone, no expectation, just openness. And Jordan responded just as evenly, "Go ahead," and William took a small breath. Not dramatic, just enough to steady himself. "If I had not said anything yesterday, if I had just let you walk away, would anything have changed for you?" And the question lingered for a moment, not because it was complicated, but because it was genuine, and Jordan did not answer immediately, not because he needed time to think, but because he understood what was really being asked, and then he said, "No," his voice calm, "certain, because what I did was not about you," and that answer landed quietly but firmly, and William nodded to himself, even though Jordan could not see it. "That is what I thought," he said, and there was a faint shift in his tone, something closer to acceptance than confirmation, and he walked slowly around his desk, his eyes drifting again to the folded check, then away, as if it no longer needed his attention. "Then let me ask you something else," he said, and this time, there was a slight pause before he continued, not out of hesitation, but because the question mattered. "If I wanted to do this differently, if I wanted to understand people without trying to control the outcome, where would I even start?" And the room seemed to quiet around him as he spoke, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represented. A man who had built his life on certainty, now asking for guidance without pretending he already had the answer, and on the other end of the line, Jordan did not rush to fill the silence, letting it settle for just a moment before responding. "You start by listening without deciding first," he said, his voice steady, "and you accept that you might not like what you hear." And William closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because the simplicity of the answer made it harder to ignore. And when he opened them again, the city outside looked the same, yet felt different, as if he was seeing it with a layer he had been missing before, and he gave a small nod, even though the gesture was only for himself. "All right," he said quietly, "then I will start there." And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the line still open, not uncomfortable, not forced, just present, and then Jordan said, "That is all anyone can do." And there was no instruction in it, no expectation, just a statement of truth, and William exhaled slowly, a quiet release that carried more meaning than the conversation itself, and when he finally ended the call, he did not immediately move, did not return to his schedule or his tasks. He simply stood there, holding the phone for a second longer before setting it down, and as the morning continued around him, the city moving forward in its usual rhythm, it became clear that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood. And as William Carter stood in his office, no longer rushing to define the next step, he realized that for the first time, he was not trying to get ahead of the moment, he was finally allowing himself to be in it. The rest of the day moved forward the way it always did, meetings scheduled, decisions made, numbers reviewed, but something about the way William Carter moved through it all had shifted in a way no one around him could quite name, because nothing outward had changed. His voice was still steady, his presence still commanding, his answers still precise, yet there was a pause now where there had never been one before, a fraction of a second where he listened just a little longer, where he looked just a little deeper, and those who worked closely with him felt it without understanding it, a difference in rhythm, subtle but undeniable. And as the hours passed and the afternoon light softened into evening, he found himself returning again and again to a single thought, not forced, not repeated deliberately, but present in the background of everything he did, a quiet reminder of a moment that could not be undone or ignored. And when the final meeting ended, and the office began to empty, he remained seated for a while longer, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but because leaving felt different now, as if stepping out carried a weight that had not existed before. And eventually he stood, moving slowly across the room, his eyes drifting once more to the folded check resting in the corner of the desk, and this time, without hesitation, he picked it up, holding it between his fingers for a moment before walking over to the window. The city now glowing beneath the night sky, alive in ways that had nothing to do with him, and he looked down at the check again, the amount still printed clearly, still significant by any standard, yet somehow smaller than it had ever been, and after a brief pause, he folded it once more, not carefully this time, not with intention to preserve it, but simply as something that no longer needed to be kept intact. And he slipped it into his pocket, not as value, but as a reminder, and then he turned away, walking toward the door without looking back. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building surrounded him again, familiar yet somehow new, and he moved through it with the same steady pace he always had, but without the urgency that once defined every step, and when he reached the lobby, the same space where everything had begun just the day before, he paused briefly, not for long, just enough to let the memory of that moment settle in, the rain, the voice, the offer. The certainty he had carried then, and the silence that followed when it had all shifted, and he allowed himself to stand there for a second, not as the man who had orchestrated a test, but as someone who had witnessed something he could not explain away, and then he continued forward, stepping outside into the cool night air, the city stretching out around him, unchanged and yet no longer seen the same way, and across the street, among the steady flow of people moving through their own lives, there was a brief moment where he thought he saw a familiar figure, a silhouette moving with that same unhurried certainty, blending into the rhythm of the city without drawing attention. And he did not call out, did not step forward, because he understood now that some moments were not meant to be held on to, only learned from, and as he stood there, watching the movement of the crowd, he realized something that had not been clear before, that the test had never truly been about the stranger he had chosen that day, it had been about the version of himself he had accepted for far too long, and in the quiet space that followed that realization, there was no need to define what came next, no need to resolve it into a plan or a decision, only the understanding that something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and as William Carter finally turned and walked into the night, blending into the same city he once believed he could measure, he carried with him not a result, not a conclusion, but a question that would follow him far beyond that moment, a question that, for the first time in his life, he was willing to live with instead of answer immediately.